So here's a situation that you've had to go through but may not have really thought about, which is, what about when you have to rely on the narcissistic abuser just to get things done? So unless you live a really charmed life or are really ridiculously lucky, most of you have at least one narcissistic person in your midst. If you know 10 to 20 people, probability dictates that you do. And if you are still a little lucky, this narcissistic person may be a more minor player in your life, a difficult cousin you rarely see, a manager that only comes into the office once a month, your co-parent of adult children that you now only need to see at the occasional graduation or wedding, but recognize the harm that was done. Okay? Now, most of you are familiar with the phenomenon called the Stockholm Syndrome, or you've heard people talk about it. Now, Stockholm Syndrome's tricky. As a phenomenon, as far-reaching as a phenomenon, it's been a little bit debunked, honestly. But the original formulation of the Stockholm Syndrome is the idea that sometimes hostages or prisoners or people who are held captive develop emotional bonds with the people holding them hostage or restricting their freedoms. And that for the person who's being held captive, that can look like them attempting to take care of their captor or falling in love with their captor or even giving them money or assistance. Now, when that theory originally came out, our knowledge of relational trauma and complex trauma has expanded quite significantly. And we understand dynamics such as safety responses, sympathetic nervous system responses, and responses such as the fawn response. We learn that this phenomenon, which was often used to blame prisoners and hostages and paint them as being sort of off, as a natural trauma response and safety response. And I can easily see how people who are having to rely on the people who have harmed them or abused them could be painted with a distorted brush of the Stockholm Syndrome. And in fact, some people in narcissistic relationships have been called as having the Stockholm Syndrome, of this idea of relying on or even adoring your perpetrator. We have got to stop thinking this way because it's not accurate, and we definitely have to stop viewing survivors this way. The greatest criticism that survivors of narcissistic relationships face is, why didn't you leave? If it's so bad, why do you stick around? It can't be that bad if you stick around. Or how bad can it be if you haven't left? Or even saying things like, I'm sure it isn't that bad, is it? For some reason, and we know the reasons, people find it easier to critique someone for not being able to extricate from a harmful relationship. More able to criticize the person who's getting harmed than they are to criticize someone for harming someone in the relationship. We are more likely to criticize the survivor than the perpetrator. More people put more effort into understanding why someone abuses rather than why someone stays. And most often we stay, if you even want to call it that, because it's often not really a voluntary decision, in order to feel safer than what would happen to many people if they were to leave or disconnect from one of these relationships. But nobody, none of us, are free of all narcissistic relationships. As I said, unless you are one lucky person, you've got some. And if you're really lucky, again, the narcissistic person is at best a bit player in your life. The least lucky amongst us are those when it is an intense relationship, a close family member, a spouse, or an adult child. So sometimes in life, for whatever reason, maybe you're going through an extremely stressful issue, death, illness, your house burns down, or you have a toxic workplace where you just have to get stuff done with toxic colleagues and have to rely on others, or toxic friends or family members who are the only ones who are available to help you. And you really have no other options and you have to have help. Or maybe it's things like you don't have the money to pay other people to do the thing. maybe whatever this crisis is, maybe things came up quickly and you are scrambling for solutions and there aren't other options. The situations where something like this most often comes up can often be things like childcare or other caregiving responsibilities, or to help with some stuff around the house. Let's say if you're ill or disabled, or you have to meet literally an impossible deadline at work, and maybe you're also having to juggle other stuff in your own life, or you have to get an event pulled together at the very last minute, and that you're being asked to do that as part of a job or something like that. So you have to do stuff that doesn't feel good, right? And you ask again. It may even feel like you're pleading if you're desperate enough. You may even promise things down the road to this person you're asking for help from you don't want to do, because it's going to mean more interaction with this difficult person just to get through this crisis. And then, because of the nature of this person's difficult or narcissistic, toxic personality, antagonistic personality, call it what you will, manipulative, you may, because now you're having to turn to them for help because you have no other options, you may have to put up with their stuff, whatever that stuff is. It could be literally in your face stuff, like, oh, so you really need me now, huh? It could be the punish you about the past stuff, like, okay, I'll help you, unlike that time you didn't bail me out at the last minute. It could be that they continue to send you mean or manipulative texts, which you have to ignore or can't, because you can't afford to piss them off and lose their help. So you either respond like normally, like there's no problem at all, because you can't afford to lose their help. Because that is what this is about, the desperation. In these scenarios, you have to hold your tongue. You have to hold back. You may even have to fluff them, which I've always thought of as, it's what we get wrong about fawning. To me, fluffing is like active and conscious fawning, right? You have to praise them, thank them, ignore their toxic behavior, and even make other promises to them, like I said, that you don't want to make, just to get them to go along with you. Ironically, there may have been a time in the relationship when you did hold back and fluff and fawn and praise and thank and ignore before you understood what their personality was about. So perhaps all interactions in narcissistic relationships actually do have a tinge of desperation to them, right? And in doing all of this begging and pleading and thanking and fluffing and praising, you may feel as though you're the one who's manipulative, as though you're being fake, that you're the one who's a fake for being nice to them and agreeing to stuff you don't want to do and not being authentic. Or you may feel a sense of shame and not advocating for yourself when they text you mean things or say mean things to you. All of this can be an utter magnification of the narcissistic relationship process of you not only abandoning yourself, but also somehow feeling complicit, kind of guilty, a part of the toxic relationship dynamics, because you are still engaging with them despite their behavior being icky. It's, for lack of a better term, it's like survival subjugation. This entire dynamic, we can even call it survival self-subjugation, but this entire dynamic can raise bitterness, resentment, anger, self-loathing, disgust, injustice, and a sense of stuckness again, as though there is no breaking out of these dynamics, and anger at the world for there not being more support. Listen, when you realize your back is against the wall and you have to rely on someone who is manipulative and invalidating or just plain narcissistic, and you lean into tactics like not taking the bait or swallowing your responses or fluffing them up or thanking them so effusively, oh my goodness, what would I do without you? Thank you. You are the best. You're amazing. Thank you. Or even just sitting silently as they insult you. Again, it's in a way, it's also survival radical acceptance. You see what you need to be in this moment with a person who is difficult, that you're now in the twisted position of having to rely on. Listen, if you weren't at radical acceptance and awareness, you might get distressed or start overly apologizing or try to engage with them in a way that implies that they could change or be empathic. Because when you can't leave these relationships, or you are corralled into having to continue to interact with them, you must be strategic. It doesn't matter if it's a friend, family, partner, or workplace. You have to see it clearly, because then you can be more clear-headed, keeping your eye on the goal or the true north, that you are desperate and something has to get done under a crisis situation. And this can be pronounced if the thing that has to be done relates to things like safety and survival and crisis. Listen, some of you watching this may think, well, this is all a Machiavellian approach. Remember, Machiavellianism is really it's when you try to take advantage of someone. You aren't trying to take advantage of them or harm them. They could say no to you. It would suck, but they could. You're trying to survive and get through a crisis. I mean, listen, if the narcissistic person won't help you, then you'll probably keep trying someplace else. A Machiavellian person would take advantage of another person's vulnerabilities or weaknesses, right? It's different than this. And the fact is, it's almost difficult to be Machiavellian with a narcissistic person unless you've got some really heavy stuff you can bring into action. And if it's not in your nature, you're not going to be able to do it. Now, are there risks to doing this, to relying on the narcissistic person to get things done? Of course there is. People who have to do this will say they feel sad, gross, and even a sense of depressed mood, anxiety, exhaustion, depletion, and shame. There is also the fear that if you've had to do this, that you're setting up a precedent to muscle up your own fawn response, especially if you're in a more chronic situation where you have to repeatedly rely on narcissistic people, and it becomes a more consistent thing you have to do. And that now you're concerned that this may generalize to other parts of your life. Again, this is where awareness is important. You start wondering, like, am I now just a manipulative person? You got to be aware that that's not the case. If you are aware that this, turning to the difficult person to help, has to happen to keep the crisis or the issue at bay, it's less likely that your involuntary fawn response will become stronger, but rather it's more of a sense of shame of having to make nice with people who are treating you badly or have treated you badly or abusively. You may feel stuck in the dynamic without escape. That's actually more of what's doing the harm. I mean, if you only learn one thing from this channel, is life ain't fair. And sometimes the people that we have to rely on are the people who harm us. And yes, they will milk this strategic position they have with us to get weapons in the bank and favors that they will pull on you later. They will bait you under these circumstances, and you will squirm and not say anything for fear that they will retract your help if you do. You will almost feel like you have to take a shower all the time to get their abusive stink off of you, and also blame yourself because you're the one who turned to them. But as I said, unless you're living one hell of a charmed or well-resourced life, few of us live lives, work jobs, have families where we aren't sometimes in this position. The best I can do is say, see it as strategic, which doesn't always feel good. Stay focused on the true north. Once the initial crisis passes, explore other situations that may, in fact, cost money that you may not even fully have. You might even have to go into debt over, or devise other situations that may require you stretching yourself even more thin. That's the issue here. People who find themselves in these situations will often find that having to do it all yourselves may actually be a more comfortable transaction, even though you are exhausted, than relying on people who will use this as a way to continue to manipulate and control you. It's important to not get too lost in the ego and the pride of it all, as difficult as I know that is, and remain focused on the strategy. And doing that may even give you a slightly greater sense of control over the circumstances. And remember that you aren't alone. Sometimes to survive, it's any port in a storm. If you do this, will you have some regrets later? If you have to count on people who are actually harmful to help you in a crisis, will you have some regrets later? Yeah. But you would also have regrets if the crisis situation fell even more apart because you didn't get the help that you needed at the time. Always remember in these relationships, you cannot win. There is no elegant right solution, least of all when you're having to rely on narcissistic relationships in a crisis. Good luck, and thanks again.